In the summer of 1942, deep inside the heart of the Soviet Union, an army marched toward a city that would soon become a graveyard. Before the smoke and rubble of Stalingrad filled the air, before entire armies froze and starved in the Russian winter, the story began with one man's vision of conquest and domination. Adolf Hitler, the leader of Nazi Germany, had already conquered most of Europe. His empire stretched from the Atlantic coast of France to the borders of the Soviet Union. For him, this was not enough. He dreamed of crushing the Soviet state, enslaving its people, and seizing its vast resources to fuel his empire for generations to come. The roots of this plan went back years before the war. In his book, written in prison after the failed coup of 1923, Hitler described his idea of Lebensraum, or living space. According to this belief, the German people needed to expand eastward, into the lands of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. To him, the Slavic people who lived there were inferior, unworthy of independence. The fertile farmlands and the oil-rich Caucasus would serve the Reich, and the people would be reduced to servants or eliminated altogether. This was not just politics, it was ideology, a racial war that Hitler was determined to fight. By 1939, the world had already seen his aggression. First Austria was annexed. Then Czechoslovakia was dismantled. Finally, Germany invaded Poland, triggering the Second World War. But to the surprise of many, Hitler signed a non-aggression pact with Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. For a time, the two dictators coexisted, carving up Poland between them. But deep in his mind, Hitler never intended for this peace to last. The Soviet Union was his true target, and he only waited for the right moment to strike. By 1941, Hitler's armies were unmatched. France had fallen in 6 weeks. Denmark and Norway had been seized. Belgium, the Netherlands, Greece, and Yugoslavia were under German control. Britain alone resisted, but Hitler was convinced that Britain could not survive if it stood without allies. He believed that by destroying the Soviet Union, he would isolate Britain completely and secure his empire for 1,000 years. On June 22, 1941, the illusion of peace shattered. In the early hours of the morning, the largest invasion in human history began. 3 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, crossed into Soviet territory in an operation codenamed Barbarossa. The attack stretched across an 1,800-mile front, from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. The Soviet forces were caught off guard. Airfields were bombed before planes could take off. Tanks were destroyed in their depots. Entire Soviet divisions were surrounded in the open fields and annihilated. Within weeks, the Germans captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners. The scale of destruction was beyond imagination. At first, it seemed Hitler's gamble had succeeded. The German Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, tore deep into Soviet territory. By autumn, German troops were advancing toward Moscow itself. Stalin had been unprepared and his armies were in chaos. Millions of civilians fled eastward, leaving their homes, their towns, their lives behind. Entire cities were abandoned or burned to deny the Germans resources. It appeared as though the Soviet Union might collapse just as Hitler had predicted. But the Soviet spirit refused to break. Stalin delivered speeches urging his people to stand firm. Factories were dismantled piece by piece and moved thousands of miles east to the Ural Mountains, where they continued to produce tanks, rifles, and planes. Soldiers were drafted by the millions. Men and women alike joined the defense. The Red Army, though battered, grew stronger as reinforcements poured in from across the vast country. When the Germans reached the outskirts of Moscow in December 1941, they believed victory was close at hand. But the Russian winter struck with brutal force. Temperatures plunged to -30 degrees Celsius. German soldiers wore summer uniforms, unprepared for the freezing winds. Weapons jammed. Tanks refused to start. Horses died in the snow. Men lost fingers, toes, even their lives to frostbite. More German soldiers perished from the cold than from Soviet bullets. The Soviets counterattacked. Reinforcements, including fresh Siberian divisions trained for winter warfare, arrived at the front. For the first time since the invasion began, the German army was pushed back. Hitler's dream of capturing Moscow had been shattered. Enraged but undeterred, Hitler refused to accept defeat. In the spring of 1942, he devised a new plan. Instead of striking again at Moscow, he turned his gaze to the south. There lay the oil fields of the Caucasus, vital to fuel the German war machine. And there lay a city that carried both strategic and symbolic weight: Stalingrad. Stalingrad was more than just a city. It was an industrial hub, producing weapons, tractors, and machinery for the Soviet army. Its location on the Volga River made it a key artery of transport, connecting the Soviet heartland to the front lines. If the Germans captured Stalingrad, they could cut off supplies flowing along the river and isolate the Soviet armies to the north. But there was another reason Hitler wanted Stalingrad. The city carried the name of his greatest enemy, Joseph Stalin. To capture Stalingrad was not only a military victory, it was a psychological blow. It would humiliate Stalin, crush Soviet morale, and prove to the world that Germany could defeat even the strongest of enemies. In the summer of 1942, the German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, marched toward Stalingrad. Behind them, the Luftwaffe prepared to unleash devastation from the skies. On August 23, 1942, more than 1,000 German aircraft descended upon the city. Explosions ripped through neighborhoods. Factories and houses were engulfed in flames. Firestorms consumed everything in their path. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed in a single day. The once bustling city of 500,000 people was reduced to ashes and rubble. But even in ruin, Stalingrad did not surrender. Stalin himself issued his infamous Order No. 227, not a step back. Retreat was forbidden. Any commander who withdrew without orders faced execution. Soviet soldiers knew they had no choice but to fight where they stood. Either they defended the city or they died. Across the Volga River, reinforcements were ferried under constant artillery fire. Many boats never made it across. Those who did arrived to find no safe haven. They were thrown immediately into combat, often with little more than a rifle in their hands. In some cases, two soldiers shared a single weapon. One carried the rifle, the other carried the ammunition, waiting for his comrade to fall before taking his place. By September, German troops had entered the outskirts of Stalingrad. They believed victory was close. The city, already in ruins, appeared ready to fall. But the destruction that was meant to make the German advance easier became their greatest obstacle. The rubble provided perfect cover for defenders. The ruins became fortresses. Every wall was a shield, every street a trap. And so, the Germans who had once stormed across Europe with unstoppable speed now found themselves slowed to a crawl. They advanced one street at a time, one house at a time. The battle had begun, and what was supposed to be a quick conquest was turning into a nightmare. The Germans entered Stalingrad believing the city would fall in a matter of days. They had crushed Paris in 6 weeks, taken Kiev with hundreds of thousands of prisoners, and stormed through half of Europe with ease. To them, Stalingrad was just another target, another trophy to add to Hitler's empire. But what awaited them inside the ruins was unlike anything they had ever faced before. The city had been bombed into rubble by the Luftwaffe. Streets that once carried trams and workers were now filled with shattered buildings, twisted steel, and smoking craters. To most, this would look like devastation, but for the Soviet defenders, the destruction became their greatest ally. Every pile of bricks was a barricade. Every broken wall was a fortress. Every ruined building became a deadly trap. The Germans, who had mastered the art of blitzkrieg, fast movement, tanks breaking through lines, soldiers racing behind them, suddenly found themselves forced to fight in a landscape where speed meant nothing. Tanks could not maneuver through the debris. Artillery shells often struck empty ruins. And the soldiers, trained to fight on open fields, were now forced into brutal hand-to-hand combat, sometimes room by room, house by house. Soviet defenders embraced this new style of fighting with grim determination. They called it Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. It was a name that captured the reality of the struggle. Soldiers crawled through sewers, hid in cellars, climbed through half-collapsed floors, and ambushed enemies from the shadows. One moment the street seemed quiet, the next it erupted with gunfire from windows and rooftops. Snipers became legends in Stalingrad. Men like Vasily Zaitsev, a hunter from Siberia, turned the ruined city into his hunting ground. Hidden among the rubble, he picked off German soldiers one by one. His presence spread fear through the enemy ranks. Every step outside a trench, every move across a street, could mean death from an unseen rifle. Zaitsev and other snipers trained entire units of sharpshooters, creating a nightmare for the Germans who were never sure if they were being watched. The battle was merciless. Buildings like the Red October factory, the tractor factory, and the Barricadi plant became fortresses that changed hands dozens of times. One day they belonged to the Germans, the next day to the Soviets. Soldiers fought in machine shops, among rusting equipment, surrounded by the sounds of gunfire and the smell of oil and blood. Civilians too were trapped in this hell. Many had refused or been unable to leave before the Germans arrived. Families lived in basements, hiding during the day and scavenging for food at night. Some joined the fight directly, carrying ammunition, tending to the wounded, or even taking up arms themselves. For them, survival meant fighting, for there was nowhere left to run. The brutality of the combat was staggering. Soldiers often fought for a single building for weeks. One side would storm in, clear a few rooms and plant their flag, only to be thrown out by a counterattack hours later. Sometimes the fighting came down to knives, bayonets, even bare hands. In the ruins of Stalingrad, no one was safe. The Germans threw everything they had at the city. The 6th Army, supported by elements of the 4th Panzer Army, poured men and ammunition into the fight. They had superior weapons, better training, and full control of the skies. Bombers and dive bombers screamed overhead, pounding Soviet positions day after day. Yet for every building they destroyed, the Soviets simply dug deeper into the rubble, turning ruins into bunkers. The Soviets had one advantage that proved decisive: the Volga River. On its eastern bank, Soviet command kept the lifeline of the city alive. At night, under constant bombardment, ferries carried reinforcements, weapons, and supplies across the river. Many boats were sunk by artillery fire, their crews drowning in the icy waters. But enough made it through to keep the defenders supplied just enough to continue the fight. Soviet soldiers who arrived often found themselves thrown immediately into battle, sometimes without even a weapon of their own. To Stalin, the defense of Stalingrad was personal. His infamous Order No. 227, "Not one step back," echoed through the ranks. Retreat was punishable by death. Blocking detachments stood behind Soviet lines, ready to shoot any soldier who tried to flee. Fear of execution mixed with hatred of the invader, forging a grim determination to fight until the last breath. The Germans, on the other hand, faced growing frustration. They were not trained for this kind of warfare. Their tanks were useless in the tight alleys. Their artillery often destroyed the very positions they hoped to capture. Every advance was paid for in blood. They had expected victory in weeks. Instead, they were trapped in an endless nightmare of rubble and resistance. And the Soviets were relentless. They launched counterattacks at night, sneaking across no man's land to reclaim lost buildings. They dug trenches inside houses, fought from attics, and even turned bombed-out water towers into sniper nests. The Germans nicknamed one building the Pavlov's House, after a Soviet sergeant who, with a handful of men, defended the structure for nearly 2 months against constant attacks. To the Germans, it became a symbol of the city itself, impossible to take no matter the cost. By late October 1942, the Germans had pushed deep into Stalingrad. They controlled nearly 90% of the city, and Hitler boasted that victory was near. Yet even as the swastika flew over most of the ruins, the Soviets clung to their final positions along the banks of the Volga. Entire divisions were crammed into a strip of land no more than a few hundred meters wide. The Germans thought they had broken their enemy, but in reality they had walked into a trap. While the fighting raged inside the city, Soviet High Command, the Stavka, was planning something far larger. Deep in the steppe, away from the front lines, entire armies were gathering. Tanks, artillery, and fresh troops from Siberia and Central Asia were being assembled in secret. The Germans were so focused on Stalingrad that they did not notice the storm forming on their flanks. For now, however, the men inside the city knew nothing of this. All they knew was endless combat, hunger, and exhaustion. German soldiers too were beginning to falter. Supplies grew thin, ammunition had to be rationed, and the bitter cold of the Russian winter began to creep in once again. What had started as a campaign of conquest was turning into a battle of survival. The Germans believed they had nearly won, but in truth their victory was slipping away. The Soviets had paid in blood for every street, every building, every floor of Stalingrad. And soon the world would see that the defenders of this city were not fighting just for Stalingrad, they were fighting for the fate of the entire war. By the end of October 1942, the German High Command believed Stalingrad was nearly theirs. From the ruins of the city rose the swastika flag. 9 out of every 10 streets were under German control. The Soviet defenders were squeezed into a narrow strip of land along the western bank of the Volga River, barely a kilometer wide. From a distance, it seemed impossible that these last defenders could resist for much longer. Adolf Hitler, sitting in his headquarters far from the front, declared that Stalingrad was already conquered. He promised the German people that victory was certain, that soon he would send word that the city named after Stalin himself had fallen into German hands. Newspapers in Berlin printed headlines of imminent triumph. But what the world did not know was that inside those last ruined factories, in the broken walls along the riverbank, the Soviet soldiers were still fighting with unimaginable determination. The Germans pushed again and again, throwing divisions into the Red October factory, the Barricade plant, and the tractor factory. Each attack came with heavy artillery and air support. The ground shook as bombs and shells tore through the rubble. Yet the Soviets clung to the ruins. Some defended single rooms with machine guns until the barrels melted from the heat of firing. Others fought with knives, shovels, or even bare hands when their ammunition ran out. Each day the Germans advanced a little, only to be thrown back at night by Soviet counterattacks. The battle had reached a point where both sides seemed trapped in an endless nightmare. German soldiers lived in cellars and half-destroyed houses, where rats fed on the bodies of the dead. Food became scarce. Rations were cut, and soldiers fought not only the Soviets but also hunger and exhaustion. Many wondered why they were still fighting for a city that was already nothing but rubble. For the Soviets, the fight was not only for survival but also for time. Every day that Stalingrad held out was another day for the Red Army outside the city to gather strength. Deep in the steppe, far from the front lines, Soviet High Command was preparing something vast and secret. Entire armies were being shifted into position. Tanks rolled through endless fields, hidden from German reconnaissance by camouflage and deception. Soldiers from Siberia, hardened by brutal winters, arrived quietly by train. Supplies of ammunition and fuel were stockpiled in carefully chosen locations. This plan, codenamed Operation Uranus, was unlike anything the Germans expected. Instead of trying to break into Stalingrad, the Soviets would strike the German flanks outside the city. Those flanks were held not by the battle-hardened Wehrmacht, but by weaker Allied forces, Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian divisions, stretched thin and poorly equipped for the Russian winter. Inside Stalingrad, the defenders knew little of this plan. All they knew was that they had to hold on no matter the cost. Reinforcements continued to cross the Volga under constant fire. Boats were shelled, many sank, but still men made it across. They arrived exhausted, terrified, and often weaponless. Some were given rifles, others were told to wait for a fallen comrade to drop his. Yet even under these conditions they joined the fight instantly, throwing themselves into the ruins with a desperate courage. The German command underestimated this resilience. They believed the Soviets were on the brink of collapse. General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the German Sixth Army, reported that total victory was near. He ordered fresh assaults, convinced that just a little more pressure would crush the defenders. But inside the German ranks, doubt was spreading. The endless fighting was breaking their spirit. Soldiers wrote in their diaries that Stalingrad was unlike any battle they had ever known. One German officer described it as a furnace where human lives are consumed. Another wrote, "Every ruin is an enemy. Every shadow hides a rifle." The city itself had become a nightmare landscape. Smoke hung in the air, blocking out the sun. Fires burned constantly in the rubble. The stench of death filled the streets. Corpses froze in grotesque shapes, unburied because the fighting never stopped. Soldiers on both sides grew numb to the horror, continuing to fight in a world where every corner could mean death. As November approached, the weather turned colder. Snow began to fall, covering the ruins in white, as if mocking the devastation beneath. For the Germans, the cold was a dangerous enemy. Many still lacked proper winter clothing, their supplies stretched thin by months of fighting. Yet Hitler forbade any retreat or pause. Stalingrad had to be taken no matter the cost. At the same time, Stalin urged his commanders to prepare for the coming counterstrike. Orders were whispered, maps studied in secrecy, units quietly moved under the cover of night. The Soviets had learned the lessons of 1941, when they were caught unprepared by Operation Barbarossa. This time they would turn the tables. By mid-November, German soldiers believed the battle was almost finished. They pushed once more toward the Volga, determined to crush the last Soviet strongholds. But on the morning of November 19, 1942, everything changed. The frozen steppe erupted with fire. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers surged forward across the front lines. Thousands of tanks rolled into battle, supported by artillery barrages that shook the earth. The German flanks, held by Romanian divisions, collapsed under the onslaught. Within days, the Soviets swept around Stalingrad from the north and south, racing toward each other like jaws of a trap closing shut. Inside Stalingrad, German soldiers continued their brutal street battles, unaware at first of the disaster unfolding outside. But soon word spread the Red Army had broken through. The hunters had become the hunted. The Sixth Army, the pride of Hitler's Eastern campaign, was in danger of being completely surrounded. The nightmare of Stalingrad was about to grow even darker. On the morning of November 19, 1942, the world changed. The frozen plains outside Stalingrad shook with the thunder of artillery. At 7:20 a.m., the Red Army unleashed a barrage unlike anything the Germans had seen since the start of the war. Over 7,000 guns opened fire, pounding enemy positions with relentless force. Shells rained down, tearing apart trenches, bunkers, and tanks. The earth trembled. Soldiers who survived later said the sky itself seemed to explode. This was the beginning of Operation Uranus, the Soviet counteroffensive designed to encircle and destroy the German Sixth Army. The attack did not target the Germans directly inside Stalingrad. Instead, it struck the weak points on the flanks where the Axis allies held the line. To the north of the city, Romanian Third Army faced the assault. Poorly armed, short of anti-tank weapons, and spread dangerously thin across a wide front, they were no match for the storm that fell upon them. Waves of Soviet infantry surged forward, supported by hundreds of T-34 tanks that crushed everything in their path. The Romanians fought bravely, but within hours their defenses shattered. Entire divisions dissolved into chaos, soldiers fleeing or surrendering by the thousands. At the same time, to the south of Stalingrad, the Soviet 51st and 57th Armies attacked the Romanian 4th Army Corps. Once again, the results were catastrophic. The Romanians had no chance against Soviet tanks and concentrated artillery fire. Their lines buckled and collapsed, leaving huge gaps. Through these breaches, Soviet armored columns poured forward. They advanced rapidly across the steppe, cutting through villages, overrunning command posts, and leaving destruction in their wake. The plan was simple but devastating. The northern and southern Soviet forces would meet west of Stalingrad, closing a giant ring around the German Sixth Army and trapping it inside the city. General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army, initially did not believe the danger. Reports of Romanian collapses were dismissed as exaggerations. Hitler himself insisted that the Soviets could not possibly launch such a massive offensive. He believed the Red Army was exhausted, bled dry by months of fighting. But the truth was now undeniable. Within days, the Soviet spearheads were racing toward each other, and the noose was tightening. On November 23, just 4 days after the offensive began, Soviet tanks of the 4th Mechanized Corps met with units of the 4th Tank Corps near the town of Kalach, west of Stalingrad. The trap was closed. Inside the pocket were over 300,000 Axis troops, Germans, Romanians, and a few thousand Croatians and Italians. Among them were the entire German Sixth Army and parts of the 4th Panzer Army. Never before had such a large force been encircled in modern warfare. The shock inside the pocket was immense. Soldiers who had fought for months in the ruins of Stalingrad suddenly realized they were now the surrounded ones. The hunters had become the hunted. Paulus faced a decision: attempt an immediate breakout to the west before the Soviets could strengthen their ring, or hold his ground and wait for relief. His generals urged him to break out while there was still a chance. Supplies were already low, and the encirclement was tightening every hour. But Paulus hesitated. He was a man of strict obedience, and he looked to Hitler for orders. When the news reached Hitler, he was furious but unshaken. He forbade any retreat. Stalingrad was to be held at all costs. In his eyes, surrender or withdrawal was unthinkable. Instead, he promised that the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, would supply the Sixth Army by air until a relief army could break through. It was a fatal miscalculation. Supplying an army of 300,000 men required at least 700 tons of food, fuel, and ammunition every day. The Luftwaffe could barely deliver a fraction of that, especially in the bitter winter conditions. Many transport planes were shot down by Soviet fighters or anti-aircraft guns. Others crashed in the snow. Pilots who survived spoke of endless missions through icy winds, landing on makeshift airstrips under constant threat of attack. Inside the pocket, the soldiers quickly felt the consequences. Rations were cut to starvation levels. A single loaf of bread was shared among 6 men. Horses were slaughtered for food. Ammunition dwindled. The once proud Sixth Army, which had marched east with confidence and discipline, now faced hunger, disease, and despair. Meanwhile, the Soviets tightened their grip. New lines of trenches and fortified positions were built around the pocket. Artillery batteries were placed to fire continuously on German positions. Snipers picked off any soldier who moved in the open. The encirclement was complete and merciless. Paulus radioed Berlin repeatedly, begging for permission to attempt a breakout. But Hitler remained adamant. He declared, "The Sixth Army will stand fast. It is a symbol of German resolve. Stalingrad will be our fortress on the Volga." For the soldiers trapped inside, these words meant death. They knew that without escape, their fate was sealed. Yet discipline held, and they continued to fight. Entire divisions defended frozen ruins, sometimes with nothing but a handful of bullets. Wounded men lay in cellars without medicine, freezing to death beside their comrades. The once mighty Sixth Army was being slowly strangled. By early December, the situation had grown desperate. Temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. Frostbite claimed more men than Soviet bullets. Fuel ran out, leaving tanks useless and artillery silent. Horses, once used for transport, had all been eaten. Soldiers boiled belts, boots, and even wallpaper paste in attempts to fill their stomachs. And yet, in Berlin, propaganda still declared that the Sixth Army was fighting heroically and would soon be relieved. Families of German soldiers read optimistic headlines, never knowing the true horror their loved ones faced in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad. But Paulus knew the truth. His army was dying. The encirclement of Stalingrad had changed everything. The momentum of the war had shifted. For the first time, Hitler's armies were not advancing but trapped. The myth of invincibility was shattered. And as December drew to a close, the Red Army prepared to deliver the final blow. The question was no longer whether Stalingrad would fall, but how long the Sixth Army could endure before the inevitable end. By December 1942, the situation inside Stalingrad had reached breaking point. The Sixth Army was starving. Temperatures had plunged to -30 degrees Celsius. Soldiers wrapped themselves in torn blankets, newspapers, and whatever rags they could find, yet still froze to death in their sleep. Ammunition was running out. The Luftwaffe's airlift, which Hitler had promised would keep the army supplied, was delivering barely a fraction of what was needed. Some days, only 50 tons of supplies arrived, enough to feed the army for less than a single meal. The men were desperate. Horses had been eaten long ago. Now soldiers boiled leather belts, gloves, and even sawdust mixed with water to fight hunger. In the frozen ruins, wounded men lay on straw without bandages or medicine. Infection spread. Frostbite claimed thousands. Entire companies shrank to a handful of survivors. Yet despite this nightmare, Hitler still demanded that the Sixth Army hold its ground. But outside the pocket, a desperate plan was being formed. German High Command prepared a relief operation, codenamed Operation Winter Storm. It was led by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most talented commanders. His mission was clear: break through Soviet lines and rescue the Sixth Army before it was too late. On December 12, 1942, Manstein launched his assault. The German 4th Panzer Army, reinforced with whatever tanks and divisions could be spared, struck south of Stalingrad. At first, the attack made progress. The Soviets were surprised by the ferocity of the assault. Villages fell, and German panzers pushed forward through the steppe, covering dozens of kilometers. For a brief moment, hope returned to the trapped soldiers inside Stalingrad. They listened to their radios, hearing that relief was on the way. But hope was fragile. The Soviet High Command, the Stavka, quickly reacted. Reinforcements were rushed to the threatened sector. Entire armies shifted position to block Manstein's advance. Soviet tanks clashed with German panzers in brutal battles across the frozen steppe. The fighting was ferocious, but the Red Army had far greater numbers. Still, Manstein's forces pushed within 50 kilometers of Stalingrad. The encircled Sixth Army could almost hear the distant thunder of battle. Relief was so close and yet so far. Inside the pocket, Paulus's staff officers urged him to prepare for a breakout. They argued that if the Sixth Army launched an assault westward, they might link up with Manstein and escape the trap. But Paulus refused. Hitler's orders were absolute: no retreat, no breakout. Stalingrad was to remain a fortress. Paulus obeyed, even though it doomed his men. Manstein himself later admitted that if Paulus had acted, if the Sixth Army had moved toward him, the rescue might have succeeded. But Paulus never tried. He waited for Hitler's impossible promise of salvation. By mid-December, the Soviets counterattacked with overwhelming force. Their Operation Little Saturn struck Italian and Hungarian divisions further west, collapsing entire fronts and threatening to cut off Manstein's army. Under this new pressure, Manstein had no choice. On December 23, he called off Operation Winter Storm. The relief attempt was over. The Sixth Army was abandoned. For the soldiers trapped inside Stalingrad, it was the final blow to their morale. Many had clung to hope that rescue was coming. Now they knew they were truly alone. As January 1943 began, conditions inside the pocket became unimaginable. Starvation reached new extremes. Soldiers ate rats if they could catch them. Some even resorted to cannibalism, a dark secret spoken of only in whispers. Ammunition was so scarce that many units could not return Soviet fire. German hospitals inside cellars were filled with thousands of wounded, lying on frozen ground, waiting for death. And still, Hitler demanded that Paulus hold out. He promoted Paulus to Field Marshal on January 30, 1943, the highest rank in the German army. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered in history. Hitler expected Paulus to either fight to the last man or take his own life rather than be captured. But Paulus, exhausted and disillusioned, did neither. On January 31st, Soviet forces broke into Paulus's headquarters in the ruins of Stalingrad. The once proud commander of the Sixth Army, surrounded by chaos and death, finally surrendered. 2 days later, on February 2nd, the last pockets of German resistance laid down their arms. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. Of the 300,000 Axis soldiers trapped in the pocket, fewer than 90,000 surrendered alive. The rest were dead, killed in battle, starved, frozen, or executed. Of those 90,000 prisoners, only about 5,000 would ever return to Germany after years in Soviet captivity. The German dream of victory in the East had ended in the ruins of Stalingrad. The consequences were enormous. For the first time, the world saw that Hitler's armies could be defeated, that the Nazi war machine was not invincible. Across Europe, resistance movements gained hope. In Moscow, London, and Washington, leaders hailed Stalingrad as the turning point of the war. And for the Soviet Union, the victory came at a terrible cost. Over 1 million casualties, soldiers and civilians alike. But it was also a symbol of survival, of a nation that refused to bow even in its darkest hour. In the snow-covered ruins of Stalingrad, the fate of the Second World War had been decided. The guns finally fell silent in Stalingrad on February 2, 1943. What had begun as Hitler's grand campaign to conquer the Soviet Union ended in one of the greatest defeats in military history. The once mighty German Sixth Army was no more. Over 300,000 soldiers had gone into the city, fewer than 90,000 emerged as prisoners. Most would never return. The battlefield itself was a graveyard. The ruins of Stalingrad were filled with frozen corpses, shattered tanks, and the blackened shells of factories. Snow covered the bodies of thousands, lying unburied where they had fallen. Survivors stumbled through the wreckage in shock, unable to believe that the nightmare had finally ended. In Moscow, church bells rang in victory. Stalin declared that the Soviet people had achieved a triumph that would echo through history. Across the Soviet Union, families wept for the millions lost but also rejoiced that their nation had endured. Stalingrad became a symbol of resilience, proof that the Red Army could not only defend but also defeat the invader. In Berlin, the news was devastating. Hitler had promised his people victory, but instead they were confronted with catastrophe. When the surrender was announced, there was disbelief, then anger, then silence. Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, tried to spin the defeat as a heroic sacrifice, a tragic but noble struggle. He declared that Germany now faced a total war, in which every man, woman, and child must fight for survival. But inside the Reich, morale was shaken. Families mourned their sons, fathers, and brothers who would never return. For the first time, ordinary Germans began to sense that the war might not end in victory. Hitler himself was enraged. He refused to accept responsibility. Instead, he blamed Paulus, calling him a coward for surrendering. He should have taken his own life, Hitler fumed, rather than fall into Soviet hands. He had promoted Paulus to field marshal just days before, expecting him to choose death. But Paulus lived, and became the highest-ranking German officer ever captured alive. In Soviet captivity, Paulus would later testify against the Nazi regime, condemning Hitler's leadership. But in 1943, his surrender sent shockwaves through the world. The impact of Stalingrad reached far beyond the Eastern Front. In London and Washington, the news was greeted with celebration. Churchill hailed it as the hinge of fate, the moment when the war turned against Hitler. Roosevelt praised the courage of the Soviet people. Across occupied Europe, resistance movements drew strength from the news that Nazi Germany could be beaten. Strategically, the consequences were immense. The defeat destroyed the German myth of invincibility. It shattered their allies' confidence. Romania, Hungary, and Italy, who had fought alongside Germany, began to doubt the war. Their armies had been devastated on the Eastern Front, and their governments quietly looked for ways to escape Hitler's grip. For the Soviets, Stalingrad was not the end but the beginning of a relentless advance westward. Within months, they launched new offensives, pushing the Germans out of southern Russia. The Red Army had gained confidence, experience, and momentum. The psychological effect was just as important. The Soviet people, who had endured the horrors of invasion, starvation, and massacre, now believed in ultimate victory. Stalingrad proved that sacrifice and endurance could overcome even the most powerful enemy. The human cost, however, was staggering. Estimates suggest that nearly 2 million people were killed, wounded, or captured in the campaign. Civilians of Stalingrad suffered beyond imagination. Entire families perished in the bombing raids and street fighting. The city itself was destroyed, reduced to rubble, its factories and homes in ashes. 4 years after the battle, survivors lived among ruins, haunted by the memories of what they had endured. For Germany, the defeat marked the beginning of decline. The Wehrmacht would never fully recover from the loss of so many men and equipment. From this point on, the Germans would be on the defensive, retreating step by step until they were pushed all the way back to Berlin. Hitler, however, refused to learn. Instead of reconsidering his strategy, he became even more rigid, demanding that every city be defended to the last man. Stalingrad hardened his obsession with no surrender, a policy that would cost Germany countless lives in the years to come. In the world's memory, Stalingrad became more than just a battle. It became a symbol of endurance against impossible odds, of sacrifice and suffering on a scale beyond comprehension. For the Soviets, it was the mother of all battles, the turning point that gave them the strength to march on to Berlin. For the Germans, it was a wound that never healed, a reminder of hubris, overreach, and the price of blind obedience. The city itself rose again from the ruins. Rebuilt brick by brick, factory by factory, Stalingrad became a monument to resilience. In later years, it was renamed Volgograd, but to the world, it will forever be remembered by the name that defined the turning point of World War II. The Battle of Stalingrad was not just a military confrontation. It was a clash of ideologies, of wills, of nations fighting for survival. It showed the world the extremes of human endurance and the depths of human suffering. And in the silence after the guns stopped, the world knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again.